Hello. In this video, we'll talk about the first generation of British Romantic poets, including the major authors William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Before we get to Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey and Coleridge's Kubla Khan, let's talk a bit about what Romanticism entailed. Romanticism is a movement that extends beyond poetry and beyond England. It is not even the term that these authors used during their own lifetimes, not to a great extent. Coleridge used it once or twice, as did Shelley, but they did not call themselves "we are the Romantic School." Most of them did not even know each other personally. Rather, it is a term that was applied after the fact by literary scholars and critics to describe a specific kind of phenomenon in art that these authors seem to project. It is not only in poetry, as you can see from this list here. We can think of the Romantic movement and the Romantic era as extending beyond the just the poets that we'll be talking about even today. You can also think about it including Mary Shelley, Jane Austen, who was traditionally actually not even thought of as romantic, and then that has been reappraised in the past decade or so, saying like she lived in the same time as Percy Shelley, almost in the exact same place, and there are commonalities. Why is Austen often thought to be back in the age of sensibility? The poets, however, these are so-called the Big Six, still all men. The major six British poetic authors are William Blake, William Wordsworth, Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, Lord Byron. That's his title. He was an aristocrat. He does have his own name, but Lord Byron and Percy Shelley. What is it? It is an era that is from 1790 to 1830, and as you could see in Peter Ackroyd, a scholar and filmmaker, on one side, as well as my definition, my slide on the other side, an era from about 1790 to 1830. It comes basically in two waves. It's broken down to two generations: Blake, Wordsworth, and Coleridge in the first, Byron, Keats, and Shelley in the second, as well as Mary Shelley. Austen would be in the first as well as other British British Romantic authors of prose. The emphasis on the sublime, on something beyond the ordinary, beyond the norms and of typical life. The sublime is that exalted, transcendental, almost quasi-divine element. The divine can be identified with the sublime, although not all the Romantics were actually religious. Some were not. It can be sought in nature, and in nature as well as in the natural state of humanity, which is radical liberty. They were inspired by the French philosophical figure who might be the father of Romanticism in some ways, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who spoke of that man being born everywhere, man being born free but is everywhere in chains. Let's see, they also were the Romantics thought of themselves as radicals, and they were also perceived as radicals, going against the norms, at least in England at the time, and were very enamored by the French Revolution and the spirit in the continent of liberty being the natural state of humanity, as well as, of course, nature itself. Nature as the nature being our humanity's appropriate context. The individual and the imagination. Individuals, the focus is not on a society, the focus on the power of individuals, individual feeling, and individual, especially imagination. Children and rural people as emblems of this natural way of life that has been adulterated by and debased by industry and the Industrial Revolution, as well as emotion, not rationality. They were responding to the establishment, which included Enlightenment principles, anti-Enlightenment in some ways, but a focus on emotion, spontaneous, powerful emotion, as we'll say. It also is a pan-European movement. It is not only in poetry, it is not only either in England, it is something that began on the continent and is brought into England primarily in this poetic form, although we'll also look at some British Romantic art, and it is something that you can study as it should be, in an international dimension. Certainly, at least in a pan-European dimension. You can think of Goethe in Germany, or Beethoven, who's also becomes a romantic as his career progresses, and many of the great romantic musicians of Germany and Austria, the French philosophers and French authors, such as Rousseau and following. The Romantics are also revolutionaries in the sense that they are, for the most part, outside the stream of major English powers, holders of power. They're not members of the elite for the most part. Byron was born very wealthy. He actually ends his life prematurely. Most of them do die young, which is part of the mystique of the Romantics, and they certainly do not participate in the establishment life. However, they put enormous emphasis on what the power of poets. Poets, as Percy Shelley wrote in A Defense of Poetry, one of the many apologies, one of the programmatic manifestos of a poetry should be, that has a long history, 2,000-year long history, wrote that in his Defense of Poetry from 1821, Shelley writes, "Poets measure the circumference and sound the depths of the human nature with a comprehensive and all-powerful penetrating spirit. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world." The real power comes from poets. Poets are people who are blessed or endowed with extraordinary capacity of imagination and vision to see into the reality of things, into not only the way things are, but the way things ought to be. In that sense, they are the legislators of the world. They are sharing with people what experience really is, and really how people ought to live, and are before their time, because they are so radical and revolutionary. And given to that, there aren't too many actual paintings of them. If you go to the National Portrait Gallery, currently closed but will open soon in England, you will see there are very few paintings of them from this period, the Regency period, of the late Georgian period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This period when there were a bunch of King Georges, and England was had consolidated its power. It's called the Regency because the end of George II, or one of the, I think it's George II, excuse me, he could not rule in English, and his son, Prince George, Prince of Wales, served as a regent for his father. Small detail, not important. But when this period of England negotiating with what became the United States and its Napoleonic Wars against early independent France, when these figures, and you can see in the background of this curator, these figures of English establishment are so prominent, there are almost no paintings at all of the poets. Poets are outside of this stream, and in that first painting, or this one here, you can see Lord Byron in a very exotic foreign dress. That also, by the way, is part of it, and we'll talk about that with Kubla Khan. Let's now turn to some of the works. Here, London. This was Blake's illustration for the painting, for the poem that we talked about in a previous lecture. London, the child leading, and child is almost the speaker of that poem. I wander through every chartered street. Doesn't sound like it's a child when you read the poem, but in Blake's illustration, the child leading this beleaguered older London into a more wholesome, natural state outside the debased city. Nature in this image here of the well-worn, antiquated building, as well as the powerful emotion of a Byronic character there on the edge. The Romantics are writing, for the most part, outside the powers, outside the establishment, and Wordsworth and Coleridge are also writing. You can see in this revolutionary text of 1798, revised twice afterwards, called Lyrical Ballads, trying to establish to bring about a revolution in literature. This major text, Lyrical Ballads, a rather boring title to us, but was a major it was a milestone and overturning so much precedent. Lyrical, meaning speaking of themselves, not it was not these were not set pieces, but authentic feeling sense, authentic works of lyricism. The poets just speaking themselves in ballads, this country traditional form that was considered rather of the lower stations, of lower classes. They were trying to create a revolution by writing about incidents and situations from common life, not the city, not the aristocracy, not the sexual exploits of the rich, but from common life, where they thought that was where people lived closest to their natural and authentic state, and trying to write them in a selection of words that they thought was natural, the language that was really used by men. That is debatable if it was successful, but not in a kind of forced classicism. They were against the classicism of the previous century, and to throw upon it a coloring of the imagination. The Lyrical Ballads was not widely read, but it became extremely influential. And you can see they didn't even put their name on it. The poem, a few poems that, and here is from the preface to that work. I want to attend to it just quickly here. Some selections from this preface to a later version of it, 1802. The preface was written by William Wordsworth. He and his co-writer, his co-author, his partner, his collaborator, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, wrote this while they were stationed in the Lake District in the north of England, in the far country, the place where Wordsworth is from. Coleridge moved there, away from London, where he was from. And this is a crucial line, that poetry is not thought. Poetry is the spontaneous. It can't be controlled. It happens at once. Overflow of powerful emotions that are then recollected in tranquility. That you have these powerful, that sublime emotion beyond the ordinary, and then that overflow is what is channeled into language. And that is what the person who is endowed with, possessed more than usual organic sensibility. The poet has had this sort of prophetic power to create this long and deep feeling. One other quick, that it takes its art of emotion to recollect and tranquility. That is what poetry is. Poetry is that emotion that is then recollected in a moment when you can think back on it. Tintern Abbey is precisely that. Tintern Abbey is a poem that is all about recollection. It's about revisiting. It's also about a vision, just as this earlier poem was about something just the poet sees that was based on actual experiences. You can see from Dorothy Wordsworth, but I want to talk about Tintern Abbey here. Tintern Abbey is a real place. It was one of these abandoned cathedrals, and it is one of the cornerstones of British Romantic poetry, as well as this text, Lyrical Ballads. It takes place in a specific moment, and it also encodes a specific a set of different principles. Let's take a minute to read through the whole poem, and then we'll continue in a second.